When we think about climate change, we usually don't laugh. In fact, a whole host of terms have emerged to describe how depressed and anxious we are concerning environmental threats and climate change, eco anxiety, solastalgia, eco grief, climate doom. But humor, laughter, is a fundamental part of how humans cope with the darkness of life. And few things are worse than being viewed as humorless. In fact, it can undermine entire movements when they become viewed as sanctimonious or out of touch. So today, we're talking all about the unexpected role of comedy in fighting climate change. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Associate Director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder, you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. So I promise that today we're talking all about comedy, and today our guest is Dr. Aaron Sachs, professor of history at Cornell University, who writes and teaches all about the history of environmentalism and environmental justice, and is the author of the recent book Stay Cool: Why Dark Comedy Matters in the Fight Against Climate Change. Dr. Aaron Sachs, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm fascinated, one, by something that I completely agree with, which is there is a need for more comedy in environmental spaces and conversation. So I'm delighted to get to chat about this book some and dive into it. But I'm also just fascinated, you are a historian, you've written about diverse topics, but not primarily comedy. So where did this interest and belief in the role of comedy around environmentalism and climate change in particular first emerge?
Yeah, some of it came directly from my students in environmental history courses in particular, who I've been at this teaching job for 20 years now, and my students seem to be getting more and more depressed as opposed to more and more energized and activated. And I shared their feelings to a great extent. And I started thinking quite hard. And this was, I also have to admit there were um, some sort of emotional, personal things that I was dealing with as well. I was just thinking a lot about the need to maintain morale if you want to get good things done in the world. And I found that comedy was really, really helpful to me. And when I started trying it out on my students, they responded very, very positively as well. And that triggered my historical instincts, and I started thinking about how maybe comedy had been used in the past in particularly dark times and dark circumstances, and that opened up a whole bunch of fruitful research for me.
That's great. Yeah, I'm curious then. So I want to pivot. I think you perhaps deservedly, we can certainly get into you put the environment movement on blast, shall we say, a little bit, to use a colloquialism. I mean, you do really kind of point out, there's been a lack of humor among environmentalists. And both as a detraction against the movement, but also I think something that most folks will at least agree with is environmentalists, deservedly or not, have earned ourselves something of a bad rap over the last half century or so, whether it's being labeled tree huggers, or you go into a really amusing anecdote about a Jesse Eisenberg guest appearance on Modern Family, where he plays kind of the obnoxious California neighbor telling off everyone about, how they're not being quite perfectly environmental enough that I had to seriously try to critically withdraw myself a little bit from, because I think my parents probably watched that episode and have a lot of thoughts about me in that. Um, so yeah, so I think that deservedly or not, there's a critique happening here of a movement that is viewed rightly or wrongly as humorless. So can you walk us through that a little bit? Where did this movement come from in terms of not having any funny? And then maybe we'll get into maybe where it can go and find some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a well-earned reputation, unfortunately. I mean, of course, there are exceptions, but and I would take it back more than half a century. I think it goes back even more than a century. When people first started talking about, especially preserving wilderness, and I'm thinking here
Mm,
of John Muir as the founder of the Sierra Club in the 1890s, and the sort of growth of the national parks movement and system during the progressive era in the early 20th century. There was a fair amount of elitism in that movement. Um, and it was mostly about how we need to preserve these places that we know how to appreciate, and mostly um, we're talking about upper middle class white folks. And because we have this well-earned appreciation for them, we have to protect them from any sort of damaging use which the masses might want.
mm,
Including in some cases, famously in California, um, the the feud that may have killed John Muir over the Hetch Hetchy Valley, um, part of Yosemite National Park, but the city of San Francisco, having just been through a terrible earthquake and fire, wanted water from the Hetch Hetchy Valley um, for the city of San Francisco, quite understandably in that moment, and people in the um, it wasn't called the environmental movement at the time, but people in the what was called usually the conservation movement insisted that damming the Hetch Hetchy River would be like desecrating one of the Lord's temples. Um, and, even though I certainly love wilderness myself, and I'm glad that some of it has been preserved, um, that fight made the conservationists look pretty bad. They were quite self-righteous about it. And there was, another part of what tended to happen in that time period was that with many of these battles over, saving wilderness areas or even just saving a forest from logging, there was quite a bit of alarmist rhetoric, like, "Oh no, this is it. This is going, this is the last wilderness we'll ever have, or this is the last forest we'll ever have." Um, and it really came to seem to a lot of the broader public that these conservationists were kind of crying wolf, as it were, and not thinking about you could say the greater good. And it's hard, it's hard to make those kinds of arguments. And I think the usual way it was done was just kind of alienating to many people from the beginning. Um, then if we want to keep talking about 20th century history, we could get into that more. But I think my main message is that the movement that became environmentalism had some problematic origins and has really struggled to sort of break out of those tendencies.
Well, and I do want to dig in a little bit too, because certainly you go into depth on wilderness and kind of early environmentalism there. but also noting not only that continues in the mid-century, but actually gets called out. And you give some examples along the lines of Richard Pryor, really, kind of calling out particularly white environmentalism and noting how it's not an inclusive arena, and it's something that we've talked about on the show in great length. And when we think about environmental justice movement, it's certainly something key there. And so I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit both about that divide between kind of white and people of color environmentalism in the kind of latter part of the mid-century, but also the very fair critiques that came out of comedians, which I think
Yeah.
is a really interesting way to dig into that.
Yeah. Thanks. There's a really important pivot point for both comedy and environmentalism in the 60s and 1960s and 1970s. Um, Comedy becomes much more both personal and political.
Mm,
And you get people, for instance, contributing very directly to the civil rights movement through comedy. And Dick Gregory is perhaps the best example of that, the great African American comedian, from the 1960s, but then he lived on much longer than that and continued pursuing all kinds of interesting causes and also being funny about it. Um, but I mentioned the civil rights movement in part just to say that that movement too started out very serious. Most social movements do, and that's totally understandable. But the civil rights movement realized that comedy could be a great tool for first of all, making fun of the people they considered to be the bad guys. So within the civil rights movement in the 1960s, there were some great jokes going around making fun of segregationists and white supremacists.
mm,
Um, but then also, Dick Gregory was masterful at making fun of himself to just sort of humanize himself and make himself more relatable to other people and to say like I have these political ideas that I want to share with you, and part of me even wants to convince you that I'm right, but I'm just a regular guy, and I have a sense of humor about myself. I'm not going to do it from up on a high horse. Um, and that was huge in terms of winning audience for the civil rights movement. A lot of African American comedians at exactly this moment in the 1960s were moving off of the circuit that they had been on for a long time, which was basically just only African American audiences, only African American. It was basically comedy was segregated for a long time. Um, but this kind of um, self-degradation as a form of humor to sort of get people onto their side, won just much bigger white audiences and then won political converts.
mm,
Um, Meanwhile, environmentalism was starting to explode. We had Rachel Carson publishing Silent Spring in 1962, and really that really caught on with a lot of people. But the problem with the message of Silent Spring is it's basically terrifying, right? It's basically saying, well, everything is poison now. Sorry. Um, and environmentalists, you know, took a long time to figure out how to communicate that message effectively so that it didn't just immobilize people with this sense of fear and despair. And so my argument is that there was this possibility there when environmentalists could have learned from other social movements like civil rights and from comedians who were starting to do these really interesting things right at that moment, but it just didn't really take, and environmentalists remained grim and sanctimonious, and they still are often like that. Although I do think they're starting to lighten up a little bit. And I have to say, I've been working on the link between climate change, politics, and comedy for a number of years now, and it feels like it has really a lot more comedy has come out in the last couple of years. So
And I want to get to that. But first, I'm really fascinated, one, by seeing someone address Silent Spring without glowing praise, honestly. Not that you're, derogatory of it or tearing it apart, but it does seem to be one of these, kind of benchmarks of the movement that is usually solely heralded for its genius and brilliance. And the critique that you offer, that it is, somewhat overwhelming and somewhat this kind of doomerist conversation, I think is an interesting critique, not just to take from this kind of canonical text, if we want to call it that, but to the present. There's a legacy that goes from the earlier parts of the environmental movement right into climate change, where we can see any number of scientists, starting really in the late '90s and certainly throughout the 2000s, essentially making arguments around, we're already past the point of no return. There's nothing we can do. There's nothing to be done on this. And the kind of ineffective nature of it, and in a similar vein, apparently this is just Weston's gonna throw out pop culture references for the episode. But there's a bit in a show called The Newsroom by Aaron Sorkin where there's an environmentalist brought on, and it's very much a little riff where they're making fun of the environmentalist, but essentially comes on and they say, tell us about climate change, tell us about global warming and how it's changing. And he says, well, there's nothing we can do. Like, it's too late. We're past the point. And all of the media people are kind of sitting there going, this is supposed to be a 4-minute segment, and he's not saying anything because he's just done. Like, what you have to give us more than that. And I mean, that's not effective. It's just like, it's like, there's a reason Sorkin's critiquing it. There's a reason we're critiquing it, but it's the kind of bought in of we're already past that point. One, scientists, most scientists will tell you that's simply not true. But two, it's not effective for trying to generate interest in a movement and make us feel like we do have power to still address what's coming.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I found myself really, especially with regard to my students, just thinking hard about what is activating for people. How do we sort of help this movement keep going even in the darkest times when so many people are saying we are doomed. I also have to say, just, I
Yeah.
love Rachel Carson. Um, Silent Spring is probably the most important environmental text that's ever been published. So just to throw that out there. But yes, it played very much into this fatalistic and terrifying narrative that has been a hallmark, especially of the more recent environmental movement. I do think, one of the great things about Rachel Carson's writing is that her love of the natural world also does come through. So there's this reminder that there's so much joy and solace to be found out in the natural world, and environmentalists sometimes um, have used that to great effect, I think. And part of what I'm saying with this work is just that it's useful to have a varied toolkit, and comedy can be one other tool that just hasn't been tried very much, but that could be really helpful and hopefully activating to people. We have to break out of that fatalism and that sense of inevitability. And I've tried to argue also that history as a discipline, as a field, is really useful for that as well, because what history teaches is that everything is contingent. That nothing, there's never been anything inevitable. Once you start studying history, you realize that these small actions, these small decisions that people make have a huge impact, and things easily could have gone a very different way. If that one person had voted against Indian removal in 1830, then we would have a very different kind of history to be talking about potentially. Um, and that, I certainly have always tried to tell my students that what that means, what that understanding of historical contingency means, that actually your actions do make a huge difference. Like you can affect outcomes, even though you're one tiny person. in a gigantic world. So, you know, it's it is a difficult situation. Climate change is incredibly scary, and can be immobilizing when you think about it too much, depressing. Um, and we all have to find a way of stepping back a little bit, gaining some purchase on the situation, and moving forward with greater determination. And that, you know, people can get to that in different ways. And I encourage them to do so. But for me, comedy has been a really, really useful way.
Well, and I'm really glad you point us to history because it's somewhere that I wanted to go is, I found it fascinating how you actually go to the early modern a great deal in the book to talk through both the use of dark humor, but also to exactly your point that humans actually have endured real climatological change before. We've been through periods where the climate has changed on us when environments have shifted radically, and I would love to hear you talk some about the role of humor, the surprising role of humor that you found in the early modern in particular, and how I found that kind of fascinating, the parallels you were drawing between, hundreds of years ago and today in thinking about how we've processed this as a species.
Yeah, thanks. No, it was fun to turn up examples of dark comedy from so many hundreds of years ago, and just yeah, remembering that human history has been quite difficult. Um, and people have found amazing ways of coping and surviving. Anyway, one famous example that maybe you're thinking of is the Little Ice Age, which affected early modern Europe and North America for that matter. But there's a very famous essay by Jonathan Swift called "A Modest Proposal."
Kind of a
Um,
classic example of satire when we talk
yeah,
about satire, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And in that essay, there's a famine, and his proposal is that poor people sell their children to wealthy people who can eat them. Um, and so it's a win-win if you sell your child at exactly the right time, because you can feed them with mother's milk for about a year, and then after that, they would start costing you money because you would have to feed them. But instead, you just sell them to the wealthy. You get some money, and the wealthy get some food. And of course, it was making fun of the fact that the wealthy were hoarding resources, and it was meant to be satire with a real edge, but it was also a way of just sort of stepping back and saying, like, there are solutions to this problem. Another one that I found particularly funny was Daniel Defoe in his book Journal of a Plague Year. The narrator is walking around when the plague has shut down London for a while. And this is a very early version of a lawyer joke. He notes how quiet everything is at the courts, and says, at least we have some peace right now since there's no occasion for lawyers. Um,
Good to know that these go back, centuries.
yeah.
Some
Um,
things don't change.
and there's also and Voltaire's very, very funny take in Candide, when there's the famous Lisbon earthquake of 1755. He talks about the religious leaders in Lisbon saying, like, well, let's hold an inquisition, or no, let's hold an auto de fe, and that should prevent any future earthquakes.
No, I mean, I'm glad you bring that up because I was gonna go right into disasters actually, because it's something that you really map out is the importance of comic potential, shall we say, in disaster spaces. And as someone who studies post-catastrophe environments and thinks deeply about this, and just someone who lives on the Gulf Coast, like it resonates deeply. Like it
Yeah.
have a sense of humor. I mean, there's a reason we refer to hurricanes as hurrications until they get really bad. I mean, you
Yeah.
have to have a certain bleak kind of laughter to get through these, and a lot of laughter in retrospect. You know, there's a shocking amount of truth to the kind of we can laugh or we can cry, and we're probably going to do both. But like,
Yeah.
it's nice to not just do both. It's nice to
Right.
have a mix and to be able to also choose, okay, who am I talking with? What am I engaging? Where if right now is the time that crying, it sounds like the right response to this disaster, great. There's also audiences where I'm like, no, 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 we're going to joke about this. You know, we're not going to dive into this part of it, but I will tell you the various hilarious ridiculousness that is life post disaster that most of us have unfortunately experienced at some point. And so I would love to hear some of the surprising examples that you pull on, but also that role of comedy in disaster.
Yeah. And here what you were just saying makes me think of a great book by Rebecca Solnit
Mm.
that came out probably like 15 years ago now, that is all about the way that communities often come together immediately following disasters. And
The paradise built in hell, I assume.
exactly, yes. Thank you for the title. Yeah, and probably her most cogent example is her study of Hurricane Katrina. And you find that people actually have these very deep resources that they can call on and very deep desires to be helpful to other people and bond together. And she also talks in that book about the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. And I mean, San Francisco already had a kind of interesting alternative culture, and um, and it really came out in the aftermath of that disaster. There are all kinds of documented anecdotes of people, like there's one sign that people held up that said something like "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may have to go to Oakland." So yeah, San Franciscans were already making fun of Oakland in 1906,
I'm
but
partial to the Tennessee Williams. There are only three cities in America: New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco. Everywhere else is Cleveland. Uh, yeah,
Um, I was just in Cleveland and I love Cleveland,
I
but
do
yes.
too. It's a great city, underrated city.
Um, and Oakland for that matter is wonderful. But yeah, there really there often has been this sense that, you know, comedy can help us remember that we're human, and that we have a lot in common, and that we're interested in mutual support. Um, I mean, when I've talked about this book and the historical examples that I got quite interested in while writing the book, the um, the most sort of surprise that I've encountered in audiences and interlocutors is related to the Holocaust. You know, the Holocaust is something that to this day is very, very hard to joke about. And another thing about comedy is that it's complicated. It's a very weird genre. It sometimes works for some people, and simultaneously can be offensive or just unfunny to other people. Um, but the fact is, and again, this is very, very well documented, people in concentration camps told jokes to each other to sort of keep their sanity and to remind themselves of their humanity. They held circuses, they held cabarets, variety shows. They made fun of their SS guards, and you know that was all part of a survival strategy, and it was really important. And in fact, survivors have talked about it quite a bit as being an important reason that they made it through that experience with, you know, some of their sensibilities and faculties intact. Obviously, it was going to be traumatic no matter what. But many people have testified that comedy really, really helped them through it. And you know, the same. I also have a long section in the book about African American culture, including, you know, joking that happened on plantations among enslaved people, to, you know, make fun of their masters and other white folks, and just to sort of boost their own morale, so that they can endure better what they had to endure. You know, music did that for them as well. Religion did that for them as well. But comedy had an important role too.
That's something that I think is actually, incredibly important that we often elide in an easy kind of black and white narrativization of especially traumatic periods and conditions, but it reduces those who are going through impossible things, right? The Holocaust is an impossible thing to go through, but it reduces people to no longer being human.
Yeah.
To imagine that every second of every day, is just agony and traumatic pain, is to deny that people crave joy and laughter and a full range of human emotion that really speaks to you. You didn't read Anne Frank's diary if you took that takeaway. I mean, it's just like that. Part of what's
Yeah.
remarkable about that text is we see how much even in the worst of human conditions, people strive and struggle to have moments of joy and normalcy and laughter, and crushes and the full
Yeah.
gamut of human life. I remember, not a Holocaust example, but my mother was a great fan of Angela's Ashes, and she had always talked about it when I was a kid, and I was always like, that is going to be too sad for me. I have no desire to read this book. And I finally picked it up a couple of years ago and was just blown away by the literary brilliance of it, which is it is deeply funny. It's an
Yeah.
incredibly funny book about something remarkably difficult, in that perspective and awareness allows you to engage. And I mean, it's a remarkable text because it is, yes, deeply upsetting and difficult, and also incredibly funny and truly laugh out loud funny throughout, in a way that shows that complexity, and that way that this is a coping mechanism for us. This is something that I think in particular, the subtitle of your book, Why Dark Comedy Matters, really taps into. And so I would love to hear a little bit about, in particular, why dark comedy you think is so significant in this space.
Yeah. I mean, the basic answer is we live in dark times.
Fair.
Yeah. But yeah, I found that you know, it's dark comedy through the ages that has been necessary to help people you know, there's something to be said for escapism, of course. But if you're really feeling the dark times that you're in, you ultimately don't want to deny that, right? I mean, that denialism is not going to get you anywhere, because no matter how often you're able to escape, you've got to come back to that difficult reality that you're facing, right? So what dark comedy does brilliantly, I think, is make a full acknowledgement of the disastrous circumstances that you're facing. And then it says, okay, but we're still human. And, you know, and there's still possibility here. There's still some light in the darkness. And the key is just to um, find enough of that to keep going. It's, you know, it's not a matter of like crushing the darkness, banishing the darkness forever. That's not going to happen. There's always going to be difficult stuff. Even, I use the term dark comedy, but it's basically a synonym for gallows humor. And gallows humor, and this is also something that I realized as I started doing this research is that people haven't actually studied this all that much. There are not a million scholarly works on gallows humor. It was sort of named fairly recently, actually during World War II, which that might be interesting to say more about. But right now the point is just that, like gallows humor, if you imagine somebody literally on a gallows joking, they're not gonna probably not gonna be funny enough to save their own life. Uh,
They are, we have
but
great new comic talent. I mean, that is
right.
remarkable.
Um, but they might be able to say something that could have an impact on those who are watching, those who are going to live on after this literal execution. It also makes me think of the the famous scene in Life of Brian, Monty Python, Life of
I was
Brian,
going to
where
say there was something very Monty Python about the imagery happening.
people like more than 20 people in the desert up on crucifixes singing "Always look on the bright side of life." It's not for them.
But
It's
it
for the
has remained a cultural phenomenon in England in particular. I mean, go to the pub anytime to put on a soccer game, and you're going to hear somebody singing it in the corner when something good happens. I mean, that has truly just had a remarkable outsized impact in the country. Something that that this makes me think of from the book that I admire, and that I'm going to lean a little bit into my own theater background here, since you happily threw in a number of theater examples. Thank you.
yeah.
You talk about Fiddler on the Roof, which I think is
Yeah.
kind of a perfect example, actually, of some of what you're getting at, in that, again, to that kind of like, we often want to be so black and white about things, right? And it's like, I think people can hear, comedy and environment and climate change, like these are not topics that we should be making funny. And the reality is, like, as we've kind of pointed to, there's a duality to everything, but also there's a mixture. Fiddler on the Roof, I will stake my reputation as a theater scholar on, is not a comedy. It doesn't really fit into the comic model, but it has a huge amount of humor, right? It has, I mean, there's a reason Zero Mostel is cast and Topol.
Right.
These are deeply funny interpreters of the text. And you do a great job of breaking apart all of the gallows humor, the dark humor that runs throughout, even into Anatevka, where they are literally leaving their homes and finding things to joke about. And I think opening up our imagination of the potential to comedy, to not just being kind of a static, well, it's a set of jokes, well, it's comedy is just is an easy laugh, but rather as part and parcel of what we're doing. That it's not probably the solution all on its own just to make us laugh, but it doesn't mean it should be absent. That these, with the tragic and the comic together, we are more likely to move forward. I find that a really thoughtful critique of how we imagine activist groups in particular to want to work. And so I'm curious, if you just want to talk about Fiddler for 10 minutes, because I'm always happy to talk about, no. But, if you want to use that to break apart a little bit some of the role of comedy in these unexpected spaces, and how we should be thinking about comedy as a part of more of what we're doing.
Yeah. Thanks. I sort of feel like my fundamental worldview was shaped by watching Fiddler on the Roof over and over
Having done it in summer stock, I think more than once, it was one of those where I'm like, yeah, okay, this is taking me back.
again. Yeah, and your mention of Zero Mostel also makes me think of him in the movie The Producers,
Great, yeah.
where they put on the musical Springtime for Hitler. And that, um, that offended some people. I mean, like that was only about 15 years removed from World War II, and it was too soon for some people. But of course, it also um, became a classic movie that many people have loved. I do, I did a lot of reading as I was thinking about the role of comedy, and I've always loved reading Shakespeare and just took so much inspiration from the language whenever I've read his plays, and I went back to him in part because I remembered that some of the funniest moments in Shakespeare are actually in the histories. We think of Shakespeare as like, well, he wrote tragedies, he wrote comedies, he wrote a few histories. Of course, you're going to find the comedy in the comedies, but there's comic relief in every tragedy, every single one. And,
The
false.
original knock knock joke, right? I mean, we love to point to Macbeth and point out the original knock knock joke here. I mean, it's yeah, yeah.
Yes. And Falstaff, one of the greatest comedic characters in all of literature, is in the histories. It's just, it is a fundamental part of life. And I especially liked what you said about the mixture of tragedy and comedy as being particularly stimulating. I think, you know, tragedy often, at least, the original ancient form of tragedy comes with catharsis, and that can be good for morale, for sure. But there's also in a lot of tragedy a sense of fate just kind of coming down and hovering over you. And I think comedy, what I like about comedy is that it's just more unpredictable. It taps into that sense of contingency a little bit more, like when I was talking about history. And so when you combine tragedy and comedy, tragedy gives you the acknowledgement of the grim reality and in some ways the power of fate. But comedy says like, okay, it's powerful, but it's not all powerful, and you never know what's going to happen. Um,
Well, and
so
I teach on tragedy periodically, and I don't want to go too in the weeds on it, but I mean, to your fate point, it's often, I don't, there's different ways we can define tragedy, but certainly one element that folks have used in the past is that kind of idea of, tragedy is for the gods and kings, right? And we get into the mid-century of the US, and there's suddenly a dramatic revolution with Arthur Miller, who goes to the New York Times and says, tragedy is for the common man. But until that, like, tragedy was for gods and kings. Comedy was for people, and like I think especially for climate change, like putting this solely in the realm of the tragic, what I think is literary theater theorist for a minute is it's kind of dooming ourselves. It's this position of, well, only it's already faded. It's only, beyond the control of the individual, of the human. And actually, these are really human questions. These are really pressing human issues that we should be engaged on. And so I think, what you're encouraging me to think about is the role of comedy and actually making this feel like something that we can engage with and personally connect to, and not just feel like it's out of our hands and it's for greater forces than we ordinary people are. And I find that inspiring, actually. I'm sorry, we're rapidly coming to the end of the time. And so I do want to ask you, where is comedy in the environment going? What do you see as kind of leading the charge? Because I think you do identify a number of spaces where you see more of this work happening. And I'm curious if there are models that you'd recommend, or what are the new directions that we're seeing in kind of environmental comedy?
yeah, I mean, some of it is just that the sort of um, mainstream comedians, stand-up comedians, are starting to take it on for the first time. It's been a very difficult topic, and comedians have gone on record saying like it's really hard to make jokes about this, even though they make great jokes about racism and sexism and all kinds of interesting political things. climate change is just, like it's very hard to grasp the time scale, the spatial reality of it. And there's we're all kind of implicated. So it's sometimes harder to pick out who the bad guy is, as it were. Anyway, comedians are starting to at least experiment a little bit with it. But I think in some ways the even more inspiring examples come from well the one group that immediately leaps to mind is the Yes Men, the who call themselves artivists, artists and performance artists and activists. um, and they've done all kinds of essentially pranks, public pranks that relate to climate change. And I mean, there are a number of examples, but since I'm in a college setting, I'll just mention the thing that the leader of the Yes Men did when he was giving a commencement address at Reed College in Oregon, which was his alma mater. He announced to the gathered parents who were there to celebrate their children graduating from college that Reed had come to an agreement to divest from climate change. So they were not going to invest any more of Reed's money in um, any corporation that had anything to do with fossil fuels. And it was a prank. It wasn't true at all. And it was caught on camera, and you can see the look on the president's face as this, and he's like, "Oh no, what am I going to do?" Because the whole crowd got up and gave that announcement a standing ovation, because it seemed like, wow, this is the right thing to do. Um,
Mm.
and that actually helped apply pressure right where it needed to be applied. And eventually, Reed did divest from fossil fuels. And my institution, Cornell University, divested from fossil fuels a couple of years ago. And it's become kind of a movement around the country. And I like to think it was started by this prank.
No, I mean that's fantastic, and it's yeah, it's one of those things that's always that I work with students a lot on. Is I think you, especially those of us who study literature, history, art, culture more broadly, folks are very keen to know, well, what's the impact of this? And it's like, who knows what the impact of that prank was, but it contributes, and I think it's hard to stress to folks, you're probably not going to change everything overnight because those kind of puncture moments are extraordinarily rare in history,
Yeah.
but they don't come out of nowhere. Those kind of moments we read about are the result of a lot of people laying down a lot of kindling and a lot of wood before somebody finally lights a match and throws it on the fire. And so those kind of tipping points, it's understanding culture as a driving force of that,
Yeah.
and that we are making real change, even if you can't necessarily perfectly map that out, doesn't mean you shouldn't continue. You shouldn't, strive to continue making that change. And so, yeah, I so admire that kind of work. Dr. Aaron Sachs is a professor of history at Cornell University. His book is Stay Cool: Way Dark Comedy Matters in the Fight Against Climate Change. It has been delightful and deeply funny chatting with you today. Thank you so much. And I so appreciate this book and the work you're doing.
Thank you. I really appreciate your interest in it, and it was a pleasure.
And now we'll go to our researcher, Sophia, who has another in her series, Critter Corner, all about the unique wildlife around Houston.
Hi everyone, it's Sophia, and welcome back to Critter Corner, where we dive into Houston's fascinating wildlife. In each episode, we feature experts and enthusiasts who share their favorite local animals, the roles in our ecosystem, and ways we can all support our community's biodiversity. For this episode of the series, we will be talking to Chris Valdez, a herpetology keeper at the Houston Zoo. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Sophia, thanks for having me.
Of course. To start off, can you tell me and our audience a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure, I'm a herpetology keeper here at the Houston Zoo. Specifically for the last year and a half, I've worked directly with the Houston Toad Conservation Program.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on, and we're so happy to have you. So, now that we know you a bit better, we're here to talk about your favorite local species. Can you tell us what species you'll be talking about today and why it's special to you?
Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about the Houston toad. Like I was saying, it's the main part of my job currently. And so here at the Houston Zoo, we have a captive population of Houston toads, which is an endangered species from Texas. It was one of the first amphibians to be put on the endangered species list. So here at the zoo, we have a program where we have roughly 800 individuals that we breed and we release eggs back into the wild.
And what role does the Houston toad play in Houston's ecosystem?
Well, Houston toads, they historically there used to be a lot more of them than there are today. Toads are pretty much bottom of the food chain, so mainly they provide a huge source of food from everything from land invertebrates to the aquatic species as well, because they spend their developmental phase in the water as tadpoles before they make their way onto land. So from that aspect of it, they're not an apex predator by any means, but the abundance of them historically used to provide those lower, webs of the food chain.
Okay, and what led to the Houston toad becoming endangered?
Yeah, so Houston toads are actually what we call a habitat specialist, as opposed to the Gulf Coast toad. That if you live in Houston, the Gulf Coast toad is going to be the toad that you would see in your backyard, for example. Um, Gulf Coast toads are generalists, so they can pretty much live anywhere. Houston toads, on the other hand, they are more habitat specialists. They like a nice deep sandy soil mixed with a covered canopy for the most part. When you're looking at where the Houston toads are remaining today, they're no longer in Harris County, but we do find them in the Bastrop County, specifically in the Lost Pines ecoregion.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I could definitely see how that habitat may be hard to find in Houston these days, but what's one surprising fact about the Houston toad that people might not know?
So a fact that kind of relates to our program is these toads can lay tens of thousands of eggs, I should say. So a female at any breeding season can lay anywhere from a couple hundred all the way to 10,000, 12,000 eggs even. And so part of our program is releasing those eggs back into the wild. So we're putting out anywhere from a million to this year was 1.8 million eggs back into the wild.
And what are some simple ways that people can support the Houston toad, either through programs at the Houston Zoo or through other organizations?
Yeah, so the best way, especially to help out our organization, is just come visit the zoo, really. It's not just our zoo that works with Houston toads. We have partnerships with Dallas Zoo, Fort Worth Zoo. So definitely go check out your zoos. And every time you go check out a zoo, some of those conservation dollars go back and fund our program. So check out the zoos. If you happen to have any land between the Houston area and Bastrop area, definitely reach out to your local Texas Parks and Wildlife and see what you can do maybe as far as like habitat restoration and, kind of helping out toads on the ground from there.
Thank you so much for sharing these tips. And thank you for joining us today, Chris. It's been such a pleasure to learn about the Houston toad. And to everyone listening, thank you so much for tuning in and make sure to come back soon to learn more about these fascinating local species.
Awesome. Thanks, Sophia.
For how to get involved around town this week, it's the holiday season, and that also means it's the season of giving. So I encourage you at this time of year, if you're feeling charitable, to support one of the great local organizations here in town doing work to make our world just a little bit greener. Take a look at our back catalog of episodes for a wide variety of really fantastic organizations doing remarkable work here in Houston who are very worthy of your support. And if you enjoy this show and you want to support us, giving to KPFT is the best way to keep public radio accessible here in Houston. I hope you have a very happy holiday season. We're going to take the next couple of weeks off for the holidays, but we'll be back in the new year with an episode all about the role of art in helping us to understand environmental change. And we'll talk some about upcoming exhibits that you'll want to see here in Houston. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce, Sophia Soltez, and Neman Rinsdorf. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.